Welcome and thanks for joining me for Two Steps Forward, our daily Bible study. Again, Aid is working this weekend, unfortunately not able to join us, but especially since we were off last week, I wanted to make sure that we got some studies in for you this week. And we are up to John chapter 10 and episode 375. If you haven't had a chance to read through John chapter 10 yet, please pause and do so now. Here's my summary for John chapter 10, the great Good Shepherd chapter of the Bible. Jesus uses an extended metaphor here about sheep to explain who true believers are. He says, whoever follows his voice are true sheep. Other false spiritual guides, like he's referring to the Pharisees, are thieves and robbers trying to steal sheep for their own selfish purposes. Jesus says, I am both, one, the gate, and two, the shepherd, the good shepherd who laid down his life for his sheep. Hired hands do not have the same level of devotion to these sheep. Jesus also says that he has other sheep that are not of this pen. He was referring to the pen as the Jewish pen, so there's other sheep that have not entered yet. They also will listen to his voice. He will not only lay down his life, but he will pick it back up again, by which he's referring to his death and resurrection. Of the people who heard him, some thought that Jesus was insane or possessed by demons, but others argued that these are clearly not the teachings of an insane person because they're so coherent, nor would a demon-possessed man be able to open the eyes of the blind, as Jesus had just done in the prior chapter, John 9. It was then the time of the Feast of Dedication, which is, by the way, whenever you see that in the Bible, the Feast of Dedication is the annual celebration of the Judas Maccabeus rededication of the temple in 165 BC. In modern terms, it's usually referred to as Hanukkah. That's the Feast of Dedication. It's wintertime, and the Jewish leaders asked Jesus that if he was the Christ, he should just say so. And Jesus reiterated, I've already told you that I'm the Messiah in a variety of different ways. Furthermore, my miracles testify to that. And he went on to say that he and his Father were one. And at that moment, the Jews started to pick up stones to kill him. And Jesus questioned why they were trying to kill him, and they claimed it's because of blasphemy. They recognized his miracles, but they saw him still merely as a human being. And Jesus pointed out that that's just completely logically incompatible. Jesus told them to believe only if he could do the things that the Father could do. And he reiterated that he and the Father were one. Some of the Jews tried to seize him again, but he miraculously got away and crossed over the Jordan River. And people came out to see him, and many believed. All right, so here's our devotional thoughts for the day. Devotional thought number 1. Simply, I am the door. I am, as the I am statements in John's gospel, I am the door. So what Jesus is going to do in this chapter is he is using some imagery that is clearly very familiar with people in his particular day to move from physical to spiritual points. And the imagery that he's using in this chapter is obviously that of shepherding. And it's essentially divided into 2 points. The first is he refers to himself as the door. I am the door. Now, you need to understand something about sheep pens in that day to understand why he's the door. But sheep pens in that day particularly usually were made enclosures that were made of rocks. And you would shepherds would stack up rocks and they would leave an opening, a doorway, a pathway, and the shepherd would sleep in that pathway over the course of the night. So they were the portal by which things could get in and out. And, sheep have to be penned in part because otherwise they'll wander off. And in part, they have to have an enclosure, otherwise somebody will come in and steal them. And both of these things are totally true and important for us to understand as believers here still today. There are active spiritual forces in the world that are coming in and trying to steal us from the sheep pen of Jesus, but he's our good shepherd who defends us. And we also have a tendency, if he wasn't sort of in the way, we would have a tendency to spiritually wander off, right? Also interesting is in that particular day and age, he talks about knowing my voice. And in those days, the enclosures that shepherds would make were sometimes large enough to house several flocks of sheep. And what the shepherds would do is sometimes it was a couple different shepherds and multiple flocks who were in one enclosure. And what the shepherds would do in the morning is they would then come and they would speak, they would call their sheep, and the sheep knew enough to actually be able to identify their master's voice. And they would follow the voice. Once they trusted that particular man, that shepherd, they would follow his voice. And that's exactly what Jesus is referring to in this particular section. The sheep pen, by the way, here is it's not heaven, but the door, nonetheless, it's the fold of God's people. The door represents the portal through which people enter into becoming, quote unquote, God's people. And Jesus is the only way. Jesus is the only portal into that pen, the fold of God's people. My question for you here, Aid's not here, so I would have asked this to her, but I'm going to ask it to you at home then also. What do you say to people who believe it's too narrow that salvation can only come through faith in Jesus Christ? He's the only portal to salvation. And for that matter, what if some people don't have the same level of access as another person to that portal? We'll talk more about that actually in our second point. But I suppose we could actually get into it now. As far as Jesus being the only portal, what I would tend to ask people is, what other way sounds more fair to you? Like, if the only portal to salvation is faith in Jesus Christ, and you think that's far too narrow, and it's not fair that some people have more access to that message than other people, okay, then you come up with a plan of salvation. And you somehow make it not narrow and more open-minded. Because every world religion attempts to do this too. And every world religion comes up with something performance-based. And so far as I can tell, when things are performance-based, some people are advantaged in ways that others aren't. So for instance, one of the examples that I'll give people who talk about other religions as potential pathways to salvation, one of the without making too big of a point of it, what I want to say oftentimes is, how do the mentally disabled follow a path of enlightenment? How do the mentally disabled follow 5 and abide by 5 pillars? How do the mentally disabled, does that not put them, if you have to perform certain things in order to achieve nirvana and salvation, does that not put them at a unique kind of disadvantage? And again, other people have tried to come up with, well, why doesn't God save everyone? And why isn't that just the portal of salvation? Well, that is would make him an unholy, unjust God. If he doesn't punish sin and he doesn't deal with those who are completely impenitent, so that the same murderers and wrongdoers would just as quickly do the exact same things to people in heaven, if he doesn't keep them out, does that sound right? Does that sound just? So whenever somebody says, the idea of salvation through faith in Jesus alone is too narrow, what I always ask them is to come up with a better idea, something that is less narrow. And it's never, so far as I can tell, it's never a good response. All right, devotional thought number 2 then. Jesus not only says, I am the door, he also says, more famously even, I am the good shepherd. That's verse 11. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. Now, what you got to keep in mind here is, in the Jewish mind in that day, a shepherd, it wasn't just a spiritual mentor or something like we might think of it today. A shepherd, because tending sheep, that was such a familiar image amongst the Jewish people, it was really any leader. So it could be a king, it could be a prophet, it could be, it could be the coming Messiah. You look through Psalm 100, they are the leaders who guide the flock of God's people. The shepherd guides the sheep, it protects the sheep, it feeds his sheep. The unique twist that Jesus is bringing in here and referring to himself as the good shepherd is he dies for his sheep. Now, that's never the case amongst shepherds. No shepherd just dies for their sheep. In fact, in the Old Covenant system, the whole system was essentially based on the fact that sheep had to die for people. And what Jesus is doing is he's turning that whole system on its head and making it a system of just completely incomprehensible grace. And he's saying, no, now absurdly, the shepherd is actually going to be the one who dies for his sheep. It's the culmination of what John the Baptist teaches at the beginning of John's gospel in chapter 1, where he says, look, it's the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. The good shepherd is so humble and so other-focused that he would actually willingly make himself a sacrifice in order to save his sheep. My question here is exactly as we had done with when Jesus taught about himself as the bread of light, when Jesus taught himself as the light of the world. We said in each instance, you have to take what does this mean on a physical level, and when you push it into the spiritual realm, how does it change our conceptions of God? I would do the exact same thing with the properties that you associate with a shepherd. How does that apply to our conception of who God is? Again, we've already mentioned a couple things. We'll get into more here in a second. But that leads us to our third devotional thought. Third devotional thought is we are. So Jesus said, I am the door, I am the good shepherd, but we are the sheep. We are by nature sheep. So the first part of the analogy that Jesus is the good shepherd and the door, it's informative, it's beautiful, it's wonderful. Jesus is the sole path to salvation and grants it freely. He lays his life down for us. That's all wonderful and beautiful. The second part of this equation is a little bit more humbling. It's the implication that we clearly are sheep. We are the sheep. We are his sheep. Now, that's not all bad from an analogy standpoint. Why? Because sheep, amongst the other common animals of that day, sheep were at least clean. They were clean animals. So unlike dogs, unlike pigs, sheep there's clearly a clean association with them. Another thing was that they are peaceful animals. They're not constantly just in a state of fighting with one another or attacking humans or things like that. Another thing is that they're extraordinarily useful. Not only do they provide like meat, but they provide wool. Okay, so all of those things apply to our conception of humans. There's value, obviously, in God's people inherently, even as sheep. On the other hand, there's also some intentionally humbling aspects in this comparison to humans as sheep. One, as John Wesley famously stated in his hymn, we are prone to wander. Okay, so we wander from the things that are actually truly important. We struggle with focusing and attention. We are defenseless spiritually by ourselves. Sheep lack any kind of real navigation system in and of themselves. They cannot support themselves. They're fairly stubborn. This is one of the reasons why when you've seen pictures of sheep, shepherds and sheep, oftentimes what you'll see is a shepherd boy carrying a sheep on his shoulder. You know why that is? Because if the shepherd goes and locates the sheep and he just says, come on, boy, come on, the sheep won't follow him. They're too stubborn. Oftentimes, they're too stubborn. And so what he has to do is he has to hoist them over his shoulders and do all the work in carrying them to where they need to be. And the basic idea then is, yes, we are created for purity. We recognize the value of purity, again, clean animals in that respect. But we nonetheless need someone to do everything for us in order for us to be well. And the Good Shepherd therefore has to do it for us. The Good Shepherd, by the way, doesn't run a democracy. We're going to talk about this in a second, but the Good Shepherd leads firmly but sacrificially and graciously. And my final question here then is, so in Acts chapter 20, the Apostle Paul, when he is speaking to the Ephesian elders that he is saying goodbye to for the last time, he says, be shepherds of the flock which the Lord has made you overseers. Now, American Christians are because we're American, we're very accustomed to and have a strong affinity for things like democracy. However, that would seem to suggest that congregations, the analogy of a shepherd and sheep would seem, if he says be shepherds to the flocks that you're overseeing, it would seemingly undo some of the idea of like this is just a voting body that's run sort of like in a democracy, because a shepherd doesn't actually put things to a vote amongst their sheep. A shepherd is responsible for doing a lot of the planning, strategy, thinking, leading, guiding, all that kind of stuff. And so I think part of the question here is like somebody like me that functions as a pastor, or for that matter, many of you who are parents and leaders in your own home, spiritually speaking, or maybe you're leaders in a church, to what extent do you just say, all right, democratically, let's decide these things for our congregation or our family, or, to what extent, where is the balance between we need to hold our leaders accountable so that they don't just unilaterally get whatever they want, but also recognize that in a shepherding role, you don't just put things to a vote amongst the sheep, but the shepherd has to like lead firmly and graciously. I don't know exactly where that line is in every circumstance, but I do think that there has to be an intentional balance, and just overly deciding on the shepherd as giving them, unrestricted power is usually not healthy. But I also think that having things like a body of believers just function like a democracy probably isn't healthy and doesn't submit to the shepherding analogy very well. So if you got any thoughts, feel free to drop them below here. Thank you so much for studying with me today. Let's close with a prayer. Lord Jesus, we thank you for being the good shepherd, a counterintuitive, otherworldly, self-sacrificial, kind and gentle shepherd who actually puts our needs ahead of your own. To such a degree that you're willing to die in our place. When we should be dying for you, you have died for us. We thank you for saving us. We thank you for your love and forgiveness. And we ask that you help us continue to grow in faith and therefore be empowered to even shepherd some people in our lives too. May it glorify your name. Amen. Thanks for studying with me today. I will see you next time for John chapter 11.